Today we're talking about women throughout history who didn't just break the rules. They broke the men who tried to enforce them. And I don't mean inspiring in a vague, motivational poster kind of way. I mean women who made entire armies turn around and run. Women who made emperors nervous just by existing. Women who the most powerful military forces on the planet looked at and said, "We are genuinely not sure we can beat this person." Some of these women are in the history books. Some were deliberately written out of them. But all of them left a mark so deep that the people they terrified spent decades, sometimes centuries, still writing about them. Let's get into it. Number 1, Boudica, it's 60 AD. The Roman Empire is the most powerful military machine the world has ever seen. They have conquered most of Europe, North Africa, and chunks of Asia. Britain is theirs, or at least they think it is. Then a woman with red hair down to her hips climbs onto a chariot and proceeds to nearly end the entire Roman occupation of Britain in under a year. Her name was Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, and after the Romans publicly flogged her and assaulted her daughters, she raised an army and burned 3 Roman cities to the ground. Not skirmishes, not raids. She erased them. Colchester, London, St. Albans, 3 of the biggest Roman settlements in Britain, destroyed in sequence. In all, an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 Romans and Roman sympathizers were killed. Think about that number for a second. 70,000 people in less than a year. By a force led by someone the Romans had just publicly humiliated and assumed they'd broken. When the Romans sent the 9th Legion to stop her, one of the most elite divisions in their entire military, that legion was destroyed. The commander escaped with some cavalry. That's it. Everyone else was gone. The commander of the most disciplined fighting force on the planet looked at what was coming toward him and decided that survival required running away from Boudica. Roman historians who wrote about her decades later described her as very tall, in appearance most terrifying, with a harsh voice and a great mass of tawniest hair falling to her hips. They were writing about her with fear still in their pens, long after her death, because the shock never fully faded. Here's what the Romans did to start all of this. Her husband, King Prasutagus of the Iceni, had arranged in his will that his kingdom be split equally between his daughters and the emperor. A cooperative gesture, a peace offering. The Romans ignored it completely. They seized the kingdom, confiscated lands from tribal leaders, and then, to make an example of what happened to people who thought they could negotiate with Rome, they flogged Boudica in public and assaulted her daughters. It was one of the worst political miscalculations in the history of the empire. Boudica's rebellion came genuinely close to booting the Romans out of Britain entirely. The crisis was so severe that Emperor Nero himself considered withdrawing all Roman forces from the island. She came that close. One woman, 1 year, nearly undid 17 years of Roman conquest. She lost in the end. The Romans regrouped, chose their terrain carefully, and defeated her in a final battle. Boudica died shortly after, some say by her own hand, choosing poison over capture. But the Romans spent centuries writing about her. Historians, generals, politicians, they kept coming back to what she did and how close she came, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of fear she put into the most powerful empire on earth. There's a statue of Boudica on her chariot next to Westminster Bridge in London. It's been there since 1902. She lost, and she still got the statue.
Number 2. Tomoe Gozen, Japan, 1184. The Genpei War is raging. 2 of Japan's most powerful clans are tearing the country apart. Armies are moving across the landscape. Samurai commanders are calculating odds, choosing sides, preparing for battles they may not survive. And riding at the head of one army, sword in hand, is a woman that contemporary warriors described as a match for 1,000 men, ready to confront either God or devil. Her name was Tomoe Gozen, and she was the kind of person that gets written about for 800 years. A medieval Japanese chronicle called The Tale of the Heike, one of the most important documents in Japanese literary history, describes her as especially beautiful, with white skin and long hair, and a remarkably strong archer. As a swordswoman, it says she was a warrior worth 1,000. That is not a metaphor. That is an official military assessment of one person's combat value in the record books. She commanded 300 samurai against a force of 2,000 enemy warriors and came out on the other side. 7-to-1 odds. Most professional armies don't survive that. Tomoe did, with 300 people. Here's the part that really tells you who she was. In feudal Japan, female warriors called onabugeisha existed, but their role was almost exclusively defensive. They trained to protect their homes and families if attacked. The weapons they were given reflected that. Most carried the naginata, a long polearm designed for keeping attackers at distance. Tomoe Gozen preferred the katana, the long sword, the weapon reserved for male samurai. In a society that had very specific, codified rules about who got to use which weapons and when, she simply decided to take the best one and become better with it than anyone around her. During the Battle of Owazu, the final battle of her lord's campaign, his army was overwhelmed. Thousands of enemy soldiers against a force that had been ground down to almost nothing. When it was clear the battle was lost, one of the enemy generals, the trained samurai commander named Heitakeyama, encountered Tomoe on the field. He retreated. He made a calculated decision that being defeated by her was too dangerous for his family's reputation to survive. So he turned and left the field, a samurai general running from one woman. We know his name today only because he ran from hers. Ancient chronicles describe her as a fearless rider whom neither the fiercest horse nor the roughest ground could dismay. This was the highest possible compliment in a warrior culture built on horsemanship, and it was given to her without qualification. Nobody knows exactly what happened to Tomoe Gozen after the battle ended. Some accounts say she became a Buddhist nun and lived to 91 years old, which would be remarkable in any era but is almost unbelievable for someone who survived what she survived. Others say she was captured and forced into servitude. A few accounts suggest she walked into the sea carrying her lord's severed head so that his enemies couldn't defile it. Every version of the ending is extraordinary in a different way. What we know is that by the 15th century, 300 years after her death, there was a famous theatrical play written about her. By the 18th century, she had her own kabuki production. Woodblock prints of her battles were sold like trading cards. A warrior woman from the 12th century was still filling seats 600 years later. She was a warrior worth 1,000. History decided she was worth considerably more than that. Number 3. Kutulun, 13th century Mongolia. The Mongol Empire is the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It stretches from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, across deserts, steppes, mountain ranges, and kingdoms that no army had ever managed to cross before. The men who built it are considered some of the most formidable warriors who ever lived. And then there is Kutulun, great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, daughter of Kaidu Khan, one of the most powerful rulers in Central Asia. According to historical records, she was her father's favorite child, not out of sentiment, out of ability. He sought her counsel on military and political matters above that of his other children. Of all his sons and daughters, she was the one he reportedly tried to name as his successor before his death. His sons refused to allow it, but the fact that a Mongol Khan wanted his daughter, not any of his 14 sons, to lead the empire after him tells you something about what kind of person she was. She rode into battle alongside her father. Venetian explorer Marco Polo, who traveled through Central Asia and wrote about what he saw, described her as so well made in all her limbs and so tall and strongly built that she might almost be taken for a giantess. He also wrote that she would regularly charge headfirst into enemy lines during battle to seize captives and bring them back to her father, riding in, grabbing a man from the middle of a fight, and riding out, as deftly as a hawk pounces on a bird. But the part everyone remembers is the wrestling. Kutulun refused to marry any man who could not defeat her in a wrestling match. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a standing public challenge issued across the Mongol Empire, with formal stakes. Any man who tried and lost owed her horses, anywhere from 10 to 100 per match, depending on the account. After winning matches against over 1,000 men, she amassed 10,000 horses. 10,000. That number was said to equal the holdings of any emperor at the time. On one notable occasion, a particularly confident suitor arrived and bet 1,000 horses on a single match. Cuchulain's parents liked the man. They pulled her aside before the match and asked her to lose, to let him win, to please just get married. She listened carefully to their advice. Then she walked onto the mat and threw him to the ground in front of everyone. The 1,000 horses were hers. She remained undefeated for life. She eventually chose a husband on her own terms, like a man she selected herself without wrestling him, which in 13th century Mongolia was itself a radical act. The right to choose your own spouse was not something women were typically granted. Cuchulain granted it to herself. Here is the part of her legacy that most people don't know. To this day, in Mongolian wrestling, a tradition that goes back to Genghis Khan, male competitors wear a vest with an open front specifically to confirm to their opponent that they are male. The tradition began after Cuchulain's era. No man wanted any ambiguity about what he was walking into. 800 years later, every male wrestler in Mongolia still performs a ritual specifically designed to confirm they are not about to face Cuchulain. That is not a footnote. That is a permanent mark on an entire sports culture left by one woman who never lost.
Number 4. The Agoge of Dahomey, West Africa, 1840s. While European powers are busy holding conferences to decide which parts of the African continent they'd like to carve up and control, there's a kingdom in what is now the Republic of Benin that has a standing military unlike anything any of them have ever faced. At its peak, this force numbered 6,000 soldiers. They raided villages under cover of darkness, took captives, and returned to their king carrying the heads of anyone who resisted. They were organized into specialized regiments, riflewomen, archers, hunters, reapers, each with their own uniforms, hierarchy, and battlefield role. They were all women. The Agoge, also called the Mino, meaning our mothers in the Fon language, were the only fully documented all-female army in modern history. Not a regiment attached to a larger force, not a support unit operating behind the lines. A complete, professional standing military trained from childhood, organized like a machine, and sworn to total loyalty to the king of Dahomey. Their origin stories vary. One account says they began as a corps of royal elephant hunters who impressed the king so much with their skill that they were converted into warriors. Another says they grew from the palace guard. Women were the only people permitted in the king's palace after dark, so women naturally became his protectors. However they started, by the 19th century they were the most feared fighting force in West Africa. The training was extreme. Recruits, some volunteers, some brought in by force, some enrolled by husbands who described them as unruly, underwent intense physical and psychological conditioning. Hand-to-hand combat, swordsmanship, rifle handling, tactical movement. They took an oath of celibacy. They lived in military compounds inside the palace grounds. They were not wives, they were not mothers. They were soldiers and nothing else. When they left the palace to move through the kingdom, they were preceded by a girl carrying a bell. The sound told every man in the area to step off the road, move to a distance, and look the other way. In the kingdom of Dahomey, the Agoge did not move around you. You moved around them. When French colonial forces arrived in the 1890s with modern weapons, professional soldiers, and the full weight of European military doctrine behind them, they were not prepared for what they encountered. French soldiers who underestimated their opponents paid for it immediately. Special units of the Agoge were assigned specifically to identify and kill French officers, removing command structure from the battlefield before the main fighting even began. Uniformed French soldiers who were taken alive were sometimes found dead in the morning. The Agoge did not take prisoners lightly. A French colonel who witnessed their fighting firsthand wrote, "They are stronger than men. They fear nothing." The French won the war eventually. But only after bringing in the Foreign Legion, one of the most elite fighting forces in the world, and only after weeks of brutal combat against an army that fought until almost none of them remained. Of the roughly 1,200 Agoge fit for battle at the start of the conflict, only 50 to 60 were still standing at the end. They did not surrender. They were not broken. They fought until they were gone. The French officially took the Dahomey capital in November 1892. Their military reports described the Agoji as the most feared warriors in all of West Africa. Coming from the people who just defeated them, that reads less like an insult and more like a tribute. The last surviving member of the Agoji, a woman named Nawi, died in 1979 at over 100 years old. She had claimed to a historian in 1978 that she had personally fought the French in 1892. She probably did. If any of this sounds familiar, it's because the Dora Milaje, the elite female warriors in Marvel's Black Panther, the most beloved fictional African army in modern pop culture, were directly inspired by the Agogia. The most powerful fictional warrior women in contemporary cinema are a tribute to real women who actually existed and actually fought. And now for the supporting cast. These are shorter, but they deserve a mention, because if any one of these women had more historical documentation behind her, she'd be the main segment. Fu Hao, 1200 BC, Jin, one of 64 wives of the Shang dynasty king, she decided she didn't want to be a political arrangement and led men into battle instead. She commanded the largest army in China at the time, 13,000 soldiers, and is credited with staging the largest-scale military ambush in Chinese history against an enemy called the Ba people. She did this over 3,000 years ago, in a period where her entire purpose, officially, was to be a royal wife. She chose differently. Queen Nzinga of Angola, 1624. She formed an alliance with the Portuguese to protect her people against rival kingdoms and stop the slave trade from taking her subjects. When Portugal betrayed her, she didn't retreat. She fled west, built a new kingdom from scratch, welcomed runaway slaves and displaced soldiers into her army, and continued active resistance for decades. Both the people who supported her and the people who opposed her feared her equally. She ruled until she was 80 years old. Empress Dowager Cixi of China, 1861 to 1908. She entered the imperial palace as a low-ranking concubine. She left eventually as the woman who had quietly controlled the entire Qing dynasty for nearly 5 decades. When her path to power was blocked by 2 regents appointed to rule after her husband's death, she had them removed. 2 of them were given silk scarves and ordered to hang themselves. She then placed a 4-year-old emperor on the throne, continued to govern as regent, and when that emperor grew up and tried to assert real authority, she had him confined. She reportedly had him poisoned the day before her own death, so that no one who might challenge her legacy could outlive her. She ruled China from behind a curtain, literally in some court proceedings, for longer than most modern countries have existed. Empress Theodora of Byzantium, 527 to 548 AD. Born into the lowest class of Byzantine society, the daughter of a bear trainer who performed in circuses, she became empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. When a massive popular revolt called the Nika riots nearly toppled her husband, Emperor Justinian, and his advisors were urging him to flee Constantinople by ship, Theodora stood up in the imperial council and said, in effect, that she would not flee. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss, she reportedly told them. Royal purple makes a fine burial shroud. Justinian stayed. The revolt was crushed. 30,000 people died in the suppression of it. Byzantine historians credit her with saving the empire.
Outro. So there you have it. A British queen who came within a hair of driving Rome off an island, and whose face still stands in bronze outside the Houses of Parliament. A Japanese samurai so fearsome that a trained enemy general decided being defeated by her was too shameful to risk. So he simply fled. A Mongolian princess who collected 10,000 horses from men who thought they could beat her, and whose shadow still falls over every wrestling match in Mongolia today. And an all-female army that made the French Foreign Legion write home about how frightened they were. These women didn't get power handed to them. Most of them existed in systems specifically designed to make sure they never would. They were flogged, betrayed, underestimated, written out of official histories, and in some cases actively erased by the people who came after them. And they still left marks so deep that we're sitting here talking about them 1,000 years later, which raises a question worth sitting with. These are the ones we know about, the ones who were so undeniably, impossibly extraordinary, that even the people who wanted to forget them couldn't manage it. Boudica forced Rome to write about her because she burned their cities. Tomoe Gozen made it into an epic poem because she was too remarkable to leave out. The Agoji made it into French military reports because French officers were afraid of them. How many others didn't make it into any record at all? How many women led, fought, built, governed, and changed the course of history in ways that never got written down? Because the people doing the writing had reasons to look away, we'll probably never fully know. But maybe the next time history tells you that a particular era had no powerful women, ask yourself who was doing the telling.